So the current situation with regards to minorities in Indonesia is of course complex because there are a lot of different minorities. I look at forced assimilation using the case of Chinese-Indonesians, so the ethnic Chinese minority in Indonesia who were subjected to forced assimilation policies under the regime of Soeharto. Particularly, these policies were implemented in the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, where ethnic Chinese were not allowed, for example, to speak Chinese languages in public, as well as they weren't allowed to practice their sort of traditional practices and things like that. So I'm really interested in understanding how Chinese-Indonesians responded to these forced assimilation policies. So when you're talking about assimilation, that can be more voluntary. So for example, I'm an immigrant in the Netherlands and I'm sort of choosing to take Dutch lessons once a week, for example. But forced assimilation is different. So forced assimilation is when states use force or the threat of force to, make minorities adopt the identity and culture of the dominant groups. And so forced assimilation is a form of political violence. So think about, for example, indigenous communities in Canada and the United States, where indigenous children were kidnapped from their families and placed in residential schools where they were not allowed to speak their indigenous languages or do, practice their culture in order to sort of make them sort of Canadian or American. And in terms of why the ethnic Chinese were targets of forced assimilation, there's sort of two factors that are driving this. So forced assimilation policies actually occurred in the aftermath of the 1965 anti-communist killings, which were mass killings that occurred against communists in Indonesia. And so obviously as the ethnic Chinese were associated with China, and so their loyalty was sort of under suspicion because of that. Even though I will say that most ethnic Chinese had been living in Indonesia for generations, right? But I think there's another important part of this story, which is of course colonialism. So the reason why Chinese-Indonesians were seen as a problem, they literally called it the Chinese problem, has to do with the position of Chinese-Indonesians under Dutch colonial rule. So for those of you who are not familiar, under colonialism, there was a racial hierarchy that was set up with Europeans on the top of the pyramid, and what was called foreign Orientals were this sort of second layer of the pyramid, and this, or hierarchy, and this included the Chinese-Indonesians as well as, for example, Arabs as well, traders and such. And then you also, at the bottom of the pyramid, were indigenous Indonesians. And so Chinese-Indonesians occupied this sort of middle between Europeans and indigenous Indonesians. They were economically privileged, but they were also, due to colonial rules, socially isolated. So obviously forced assimilation had long-term consequences or had really important implications for the experience of Chinese-Indonesians during the Suharto regime, which lasted for a very long time, where Chinese were targets of discrimination, persecution, but also political violence, like physical violence. Things have improved a lot in Indonesia. For example, I think the fact that a lot of Chinese-Indonesians have started to run for political office is a really hopeful sign. And even more broadly, I think there's still a real fear that things could revert back into the situation before, which was only confirmed by the Jakarta gubernatorial elections in 2017, where one of the candidates who was running for re-election was a Chinese-Indonesian Christian, and then due to, it's a long story, but ultimately he was jailed for blasphemy. And so that was sort of a sign that things were not perfect. I think what I'm really interested in is trying to understand how minorities survive and how people like learn to preserve their culture and rediscover it, and that question of resilience, right? I think a lot of minorities are very resilient, and so I want to understand what drives that resilience.